Hello again and welcome to a brand new episode of the MMA Beat. It is Thursday, March 17th, 2016. I'm Ariel Helwani inside our New York City studio. If you're one of those who celebrates St. Patrick's Day, happy St. Patrick's Day. We're not celebrating. Actually, I take that back. Look at the man in the hat.
I still want to get pinched. Man.
Yes.
You know what I'm talking about?
Look at you. I want to kiss you right now. You look so good. This is episode 101 of
What a weird start.
Well, I said that, and then I remembered you were wearing the green hat.
That's right.
So I had to acknowledge it. Episode 101. Thank you so much for all your nice tweets and messages about our 100th episode. Here we go. A lot more to discuss, so let's get right into it. Of course, the A-Team is back this week. That is Luke Thomas of SiriusXM and MMAfighting.com. That is the man in the shirt. Jeff Wagenheim of the Washington Post and Sports Illustrated. Is that green?
Some shades of
somewhat green.
I'm colorblind.
Okay.
Are you really?
Looks beige to me, yeah.
No, it's green.
Okay.
It's vomit green, but it's green.
That's the appropriate color for today.
And very well said. And of course, that is Chuck Mindenhall, the man in the hat, also of MMAfighting.com. All right, guys. I want to start this week talking about a story that I believed back in November, December, and I know a lot of you agreed, of this past year was going to be the story of 2016, and that's free agency in MMA. And not only as it pertains to the UFC, but also as it pertains to Bellator, World Series of Fighting. You're not just seeing UFC fighters now say publicly that they want to fight out their contracts. You're hearing this from the Justin Gaethjes and Marlon Moraeses of the world, the Will Brookses of the world in Bellator, even some fighters in ONE FC. But in my opinion, none of them bigger than Rory MacDonald. Rory MacDonald saying on Monday that he is going to fight out his contract. Now, he didn't necessarily want to go this route. This wasn't his plan, but after failed negotiations, he said, all right, one more fight left. We can't come to a deal here. Let's fight it out. And his fight in June against Wonderboy Thompson will be the final fight on his current deal. Now, I think it explains to a degree why he is booked against Wonderboy Thompson. We'll get into that. But do you guys agree, first things first, right off the bat, that of all the free agents of the past year or so, Rory MacDonald, especially now coming off a win in June, would trump them all?
Yeah, he has to, and for very simple reasons. He is certainly ranked very high, but I sort of simplify it in other ways, or at least view it another way, right? So you look at Matt Mitrione, Benson Henderson, Phil Davis, you can Overeem. You can look at these guys, all the ones who made the switch, right? So he's UFC to Bellator in some capacity. They're all over 30. They're 30 or more. Mm-hmm. Rory MacDonald is 26. He made his MMA debut when he was 16, his UFC debut when he was 20. Is that not insane?
Yeah.
So he has more miles on him, and I think his eventual decline will happen at an earlier age because of his early start. Neither here nor there. He is still very much arguably either in his prime or right before his prime. That makes him categorically different than Benson Henderson. It makes him categorically different than Matt Mitrione and even Phil Davis, guys who had basically had their peaks tested. You could maybe argue Roy's there, but I don't think so. I think he's still got some big fights left ahead of him, which makes me skeptical he'll eventually leave. But to your point, the threat of him leaving, the idea of a guy in his 20s, it seems almost anathema that given UFC's historical practices, if he jumps ship, that is very different.
So Jeff, given the times, and of course we don't know what exactly was offered and what was counteroffered, are you surprised that the UFC is even letting it get to this point, letting him test the waters?
I guess I am a little bit, but I guess as you sort of hinted at it, that we don't know what he was asking for, and we don't know what they were offering. But let's just assume that they were far enough apart that they couldn't come to an agreement, and so he's rolling the dice just like they're rolling the dice. If he goes out there and Wonderboy, who put on a great performance in his last fight against Johnny Hendricks, if he goes out there, if Rory goes out there and loses to Wonderboy, that offer he got from the UFC is probably just going to go down a little bit. And although I would say that the Bellators of the world would still want to bring him in, but his value suddenly goes down. So there's a lot of rolling of the dice in both cases. I am surprised they do tend to operate differently, sign guys with one more fight or so on their contract. But I guess this is something that is happening so much more frequently now, and we are starting to see some people leaving the UFC. So I guess it's something where there's so many, you have to herd all the cats. I mean, there's so many people out there trying to rein them back in. You're not going to get every one of them, so sometimes you're going to miss them.
Chuck, why do you think this is becoming a thing, though? Why is this becoming a trend all of a sudden? Is there Is there a moment that you can pinpoint? Is there a fight? Like, it's amazing to me that every single day almost it feels like another fighter publicly states that he wants to do this now. This was an option before. Why is it all happening now?
Well, prize fighting by its name alone is a mercenary pursuit. It's just, I think you're finally getting around to the point where these guys are understanding that they can go elsewhere to make more money. I mean, for a long time, I think that people had it that the UFC was as high as you could get. You were going to get the most money, the most exposure. You had chances to get end of the night bonuses and the sponsorship opportunities. And I think all those things combined made the UFC an obvious place for people to to ultimately end up. That was the destination. But I think now with the sponsorship deal sort of limiting what your income can be on that capacity, there's no guarantee of exposure, I guess. I mean, you're still going to get marketed, but people have been complaining about the way they've been marketed. There's Fight Pass, which they're trying to break through, which if you end up on one of those cards, you never know. I mean, there's just a lot of other things going into it. But then you get you get Bellator with Viacom coming in, and they are clearly in the market for some of these guys. And you got World Series of Fighting sort of hovering out there. And I think it's just one of those things where on all those levels, they start to mesh up. And pretty soon you say, well, what am I doing a detriment to stay in the UFC? Why would I do this? And let's face it, Rory MacDonald went in there and put it all on the line in that last fight. That was the fight of the year. It was one of those things, you look at something like that and you think, man, I know he said he loved it, he was having the time of his life, but come on, that's one of those ones you see and you think, man, they're taking years off their lives in there. I mean, that's how it felt to me when they're going out in the 5th round, they're just beating each other up like that. And I'm sure that he went back, reflected on that and said, you know what I made is not worth what I just put myself through. So I think that that's the biggest thing. It's just all those things combined, and I think you're finally at a place where they think they can go out and test it. We've seen guys like Mitrione get a better deal. Sterling, who was, you were mentioning 20-something. That's the closest I could come in terms of his age, being in his prime, coming into his prime and stuff like that. So I just feel like it's one of those things. It's a business, and guys are finally business-minded towards it.
And Chuck mentioned that prize fighting is a mercenary pursuit. The other attribute that I would put to it is that it's an individual pursuit. And we've heard a lot of rumbling about, maybe the fighters should organize. Maybe there should be a union or a fighters association that will allow fighters to negotiate some things collectively, such as like the Reebok deal, or so that the fighters get a better piece of the pie. But there really hasn't been very much movement toward that. So these guys individually, maybe some of them are sitting back thinking, well, at some point we're going to all gather together and organize. But maybe there's a lot of people saying, well, I don't have much hope for that to happen, so I need to go get my piece.
Well, real quickly, to this point, it's pretty simple, right? Like, to organize in the way he's talking about, I think we would all agree if you had an association or a union, the amount you could get out of that would be significant. But the institutional hurdles to make that happen are too significant. But it's pretty easy to buy into just fighting out your contract. Look, to answer your question, let's just be real. There's deep-seated resentment about what a lot of fighters feel like they're being paid. I can't speak to the validity of that resentment, but I can certainly observe around me that a lot of them feel pretty much that way. We always talk about fighting out your contract like it's a gamble, like you're taking a risk on yourself. I think these guys feel like this is the first time I can do something that's in my control. I can go out there and I can define my destiny. I can take it into my own hands. I can figure out what I'm worth. There are a couple of risks involved with winning that last fight and how it goes and everything else. But these guys, they don't like the way they're promoted, or they're put on cards they don't want to go to. They have to fly to Australia or Brazil and pay a huge tax. You mentioned Rory MacDonald. He doesn't want to fly to go face Hector Lombard in Australia. He doesn't want to do that. This gives them a chance to say, I get to make some demands on you this time. It gives them at least some kind of power, and I think they like the taste of it.
One of the recurring things we keep hearing, especially in the Rory MacDonald interview, is there is a sort of resentment. You can tell that it's there, that they believe that they have put themselves out there, they've made themselves available, that they've done everything the OC has asked of them, or that they've went above and beyond where they should have. You know what I mean? Like they've always just done it. And I think that they start to think, well, this is going to reciprocate. I'm going to get a contract that's going to, and I feel like there's a big disappointment going on there with that.
And it's interesting. I recall talking to Rory a month after the Robbie Lawler fight, and his demeanor was so fascinating because it was all positive. He was like, that was the best time of my life. I loved every second of that. And we're like, what? Your face got smashed in. I mean, it was one of the more brutal endings to a fight that I've ever seen. But now, on Monday, it seems like his stance, while he still has warm thoughts towards the performance and the experience, it feels like his stance is now like, maybe I didn't get paid enough for that. Like that. I put myself through hell in that fight. I was this close to becoming a champion, and my face literally broke. and what do I have to show for it? And it's interesting how a few months later, taking a step back, kind of changed his mood towards the fight. I found that to be fascinating.
Well, you also, in Monday's interview, touched on another subject that I think we can't really separate from this, is very much related, that MacDonald is about to be a father. And everything changes when all of us, all of us in our lives, when we're a single, not a single father, a single person without kids, we lead our lives a lot differently than when we get married and then when we have kids. It just is a reality. When you have other people to provide for, it just changes the way you think. So he might have thought, well, this is really fun, fighting. I'm getting paid for something I love to do. Well, now it's a little bit different. It's not just I'm getting paid for something I love to do, but it's also I'm getting paid a certain amount of money to provide for this kid that I've got in the way, and that I want more of that money so that kid gets provided for better.
Would you agree that this is like where Rory MacDonald's at his highest point right now? Because I feel like that performance he had, even in a loss, boosted his stock. It's funny because back in the day when George St. Pierre sort of stepped away, and this was back when Dana White was saying, like, if I could come to Canada every weekend, I would do it. I'd be here every weekend and everything like that. Well, Rory MacDonald was sort of the guy, right? The guy who was in position to be Canada's guy. And I feel like that's probably part of what's going on too. I mean, he is fighting in Ottawa, which to me was a very smart idea to have him fighting in Canada again and try to get that market going, because that market was so huge for a long time. And you got a guy positioned where he's at. Like if he goes in there and beats Wonder Boy, I feel like he's in a great position one way or another. But we'll kind of have to see how that plays out. But to me, it's his disappointment might also be just they haven't really. I don't feel like the UFC has really been in the Canadian market as much. They're not trying for it as much, and I feel like that's one of the things that he represents. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, but I love that. I love when they take a fight and they say, okay, where's the best place for this fight? Well, that particular fight was either the best place, in my opinion, for it, South Carolina, which is where Wonder Boy's from, or Canada, and they go to Canada. So it's a perfect fight. It's a perfect booking, and I expect it to do very well gate-wise. What about the fight, though? Do you think it's possible that they said, because I will admit, like, I love this fight. You tell me any fight from now until August, this one I put it up there with all of them, including Jones-Cormier. I love this fight. I just think it's a fascinating fight, especially after what Wonder Boy did last month to Hendricks. Do you feel like failed negotiations, they say, all right, buddy, here's Wonder Boy Thompson. Maybe the most dangerous guy in the division.
I mean, they gave Andrei Arlovski at the time. This may not sound like much, but at the time, when Arlovski was at the end of his deal, this was,
the Jake O'Brien fight?
Jake O'Brien
way back in the day.
And
prelim.
Jake O'Brien at the time was believed to be like the next big thing, and then they gave him that, and then they buried him on the prelims. Now it turned out Jake O'Brien was not who we thought he was, but they've certainly tried to, look, they don't, I mean, they make getting out the door sometimes a little bit difficult. Not every time, of course.
Not every time. Like, they gave Aljamain Johnny Eduardo. I mean, that's not a world beater, right?
Right, and they're not. And look, and they're promoting Thompson versus.
Sure, it's a main event in his market.
They're getting behind it in a way. So because, and also, I think
more like Quentin Rampage Jackson, right? Like they lined him up against wrestlers. Sort of.
And look, the truth of the matter is, in this day and age, especially with Viacom doing what they're doing with Bellator, or trying to. If you ask them with the UFC, they may differ on value, but they clearly want to keep Rory MacDonald around. This is not a. He may be grumbling, but he's not a malcontent in the ranks. He's not a cancer in the locker room. He's a guy they want to keep. So it is a very different time than it was. But yeah, they're definitely giving him Thompson to be like, okay, we're definitely going to impact your negotiating power one way or the other when this is over.
So a few weeks ago, we were talking about the USADA deal and how it feels like the UFC is almost more transparent than ever when it comes to like getting out there as far as who has been provisionally suspended. Even the BJ Penn situation, they got out there super quick. It's a different time, and I appreciate it greatly. Should the UFC capitalize on a situation like this? Because I felt like that's one of the best fights of the year when I didn't know about any of this, pertaining to Rory MacDonald. Should they come out and say, like, look, Rory MacDonald, do a special with John Anik or Joe Rogan. He's a free agent. The stakes are now super high in this fight, right? I mean, this is a fascinating fight now that he is going to become a free agent. Why not talk about it? We talk about it in other sports.
Because then you incentivize guys doing that. If you're going to turn a guy into a celebrity cause because he's becoming a free agent, then lots of guys are going to say, ooh, there's a smart reason to become a free agent because I'll get more attention doing it. I don't think UFC wants him to do that.
Yeah, I'm not sure also that I would say that that's a selling point necessarily.
You don't think so?
I don't know. And I also, related to that, I think that fans should be careful what they're rooting for, because while it's
We know they exercise caution in that regard.
Well, this is true. Well, we would all agree that it's great for fighters to get paid as much as they're able to get paid. I think that nobody's going to disagree with that. But do we want a situation where the sport again becomes fragmented? Back in the days of when you didn't know who the best heavyweight in the world was it the guy at the top of the list in Pride, or was it the UFC guys? Do we want to have that kind of sport? Do we want to have a thing where Rory MacDonald is killing people over in Bellator, and the UFC's got a guy who's at the top of their list, and you're like, you never can quite, get them together again. It's just like in those old days. I'm not sure that really is. It's a good situation for the fighters. I would not necessarily say it's a good thing for the fans.
Interesting. So I couldn't disagree more. I get what you're trying to say, but I feel like this is a healthier sport now. This is a more thriving sport. It should be this way. I know that all the fighters, it's better for us selfishly to have them all under the same umbrella, but I'm happy for those guys who are getting these big contracts. I love the fact that there's now, I think it's better for the UFC in the end that there's competition.
I think it's healthier for the fighters, absolutely. I think that the fighters getting more, whatever means it takes for the fighters to get more of the piece of the pie, that's a good thing. But I think that the other side of it is, if I'm a fan and I'm watching Rory MacDonald, beating up a bunch of guys in another promotion, I want to see how he's going to do against. It's a little bit like in baseball. Before there was interleague play, all we had to go on was that World Series and the All-Star game, because in baseball the All-Star game means a little bit more than it does in other sports. But you didn't really see, back in the way back when before the NFL and when there was the NFL and AFL, and you had these teams, and you just really didn't know who was superior. We always assumed it was the NFL back in the day because they were the established thing. I think that people will assume that UFC is at the top of the food chain, but if Bellator starts signing, Rory MacDonald and add 3 or 4 more names, and they get to be a little bit closer to like 1A in that 1, 2, 3 list, there's a lot of good for that in terms of fighters making money, but we have a lot more unanswered questions there.
I don't know if they'd ever go so far as to showcase leverage or whatever the leverage is at this point, and also it'd be just out of keeping with the UFC, who's just the one thing that really irks the UFC is their business stuff getting out there too much, and I feel like this would be too much to that side of saying like, well, we're going to put the spotlight on something that we keep in the dark.
I feel like times are changing. Dana White talking about how many pay-per-view buys.
That's true.
He never used to do that, right? Lorenzo
noticed
Fertitta talking about how much revenue they made last year. They used to never talk about those things. I don't know what's the reason now, but I feel like, okay, this show is called the MMA Beat. Don't you feel like the Beat is a lot more interesting when we could talk about free agency and fighting out contracts and things like that?
It makes the fight more interesting. I don't agree with that. I think and for everyone, like when Aljamain Sterling fought Johnny Eduardo and Alistair Overeem, because when he won, he had a big emphatic win over Junior Dos Santos. You're like, damn.
Now it's okay.
You're like, Overeem is about to get paid. Thing, right? It just adds an extra depth to that thing.
I love it, yeah. And frankly, if guys jump, then guys jump, Pay them what they're supposed to be worth, and you'll keep them.
Okay, so now what do we think about Matt Mitrione signing with Bellator? What kind of a move is this? Is this the best move for Mitrione? Does it make sense for him? And are you surprised that Bellator went after him?
No, not surprised at all. Smart guy who fought on Spike TV, most popular season of The Ultimate Fighter ever. Their heavyweight division is thin. He still seems pretty eager. He hasn't had too many injuries. Obviously, immediately competitive with the division, can do the television stuff. So there's a lot of wins for him. But again, going back to the earlier question, the one you had first, what makes Mitrione different? 37 years old. You've kind of him and Benson Henderson. Now Benson Henderson jumping up to welterweight kind of changes that a little bit. But basically, with Matt Mitrione, you've more or less seen him fight his contemporaries. You have a basic idea. I mean, he didn't fight Cain Velasquez, okay, but he fought Brown and he fought Rothwell and he fought Schaub and this and that and the other. So you basically know. For him to then go and find a new, if lesser permutation of fights, doesn't hurt really all that much. And I took a bunch of calls on this on my radio show. Fans were virtually unanimous with their praise. They're like, not elder statesman exactly, but a guy in the later chapter of his career, going to get paid. He has kids. Everyone seems happy. I'm not sure what the problem is.
What do you think?
Yeah, I'm with you on that one. I think that he's a guy who as Luke says, he's sort of found his place in the hierarchy of heavyweights. And now it's time for him to either be another guy in the UFC's heavyweight division, a guy who's, probably, I don't think he's in the top 10, but he was probably lurking close to it. or he goes to another promotion where he's one of the top guys and he'll get paid more money. He's an interesting guy. I think that's another thing that Viacom has to be looking out for. If they're not just going to try to sign the just some guy, but they're signing a guy who's going to bring a little bit of more of attention. I think he's a smart guy, interesting, fun to watch. I'm all for it.
And the interesting thing about him, obviously, is he's one of the. If I can't think of another guy who was like this, who had all of his fights in the UFC, all 14. So it's almost like a change of something like that, which it's kind of fun to contemplate. I don't know. I mean, obviously, Bellator doesn't have the deepest roster of heavyweights, but I know there's some bad. Like he's got the Kimbo, so they could redo the Kimbo Slice fight, right, or something like that. There's. I think it's just one of those things. There's more option. It gives him, from his perspective, it makes all the sense in the world. As long as they're paying him more money, he gets those other platforms with the kickboxing and everything else. Because, like you guys said, I just don't think in the UFC he was never going to. It seemed like he always left it right at the altar every time he was going to. He won like I think 3 knockouts in 2014. We think, well, maybe this is Mitrione's time. And then he couldn't kind of go above that. So I feel like he's in that area, so he can be a bigger star, I think, in Bellator at this point.
He is on, I believe, a 2-fight losing streak, but his last fight was so controversial. I think he became a sympathetic figure after that fight.
Certainly did.
And so he's lucky. He rolled the dice as well, if you want to call it that.
Just real quickly, he's 37 years old, right?
Yeah.
He's in that like I don't know. Like they're making him a public in a way that he wouldn't be in other ways. Like he's going to be the Bellator kickboxing guy, right?
Sure.
But he's a little bit like, I get a bit of a Marshawn Lynch vibe from him, which is to say, I'm just here so I don't get fined. Like, just pay me the money and I will absolutely show up, and it doesn't matter if it's a smaller show. It doesn't matter if, what the card looks like or who I'm fighting.
So he loves the media.
Yeah. Sure, he's a little bit different in that regard, but everyone's like, well, who's he going to fight? What's the stage going to be like? He may be in a spot in his career where he may enjoy being a big fish in a small pond, having all the attention around him. But more than that, it's like these guys, you talk to them at some point in their life, and it dawns on them, they're like, oh, I want to make money. And then the whole thing begins to shift, and they really begin to view and orient themselves in ways that try to maximize those dollars. And I'm telling you, every young guy you interview in the UFC, you've been doing this as long as I have, 10 years, there's always that point, right? And there's sometimes, usually 5-6 years in, they're like, I want to be rich, and I'm not. We should do something about that.
I think he just wants to wear shoes during his interviews. I think that's
where he's from, the Jordans are.
That was the best part of. I think the best part of the signing was the Bellator press release. I got to give him some kudos for that.
Dude, how much has that? I know this is off topic.
No, go ahead.
I don't want to get into a Reebok discussion, but in relevant to the free agency stuff, you can't have a free agency discussion, at least for someone of the size of Mitrione or Henderson. They are explicitly calling out the Reebok deal as a contributor to some of the reasons, because they can make so much more money not doing it.
And we wondered when this whole thing was signed, we wondered if this might have an effect. I mean, I thought it might have a bigger effect by this point, but you're starting to see it for sure.
Again, it won't be the same for every guy, but guys like Benson Henderson, he has a cult following. Mitrione, in some kind of way, has a bit of a cult following, and it's really going to matter for them.
I'll just say, as a sports fan and someone who is on a beat, it's fun to talk about these things. We never really got to talk about them as journalists. So, who's going to sign where? It's not, July 1st in the NBA when free agency opens, but it's a fun thing. Now, go ahead.
And no one's retiring because their kid can't come to the clubhouse.
Yeah, boy, I wish we could weigh in on that, but we cannot. So Cris Cyborg is not a free agent, though she operates in this weird space where she fights for Invicta, but she actually is a Zuffa contracted fighter. Zuffa pays her purse, her salary, whatever you want to call it. And she has been fighting for Invicta. She is the Invicta featherweight champion. However, there's a lot of talks at Zuffa HQ about putting her on UFC 198. Now, UFC 198, for those that don't know, will be taking place in a 40,000-seat soccer stadium in Curitiba, Brazil, as they say. That's for my man, Guilherme Cruz. And they're stacking the deck. I mean, they put Shogun on the card. Yeah. He's from Curitiba. They put Anderson Silva, or at least multiple reports, first reported by Sherdog, confirmed by many others, including us, on the card as well against Uriah Hall. We could get into that in a second. But Cris Cyborg fighting on the card is fascinating because they've been flirting with this idea for a long time. She does not fight in a weight class that the UFC has, but they're paying her, and they're not really getting their money's worth by having her fight for Invicta, even if it's on UFC Fight Pass. You like this idea by the UFC just saying, you know what? It's not a weight class, but freaking hell, let's put her on the damn card already.
You know what's funny? It's almost as if, and I could be wrong.
No.
It's almost as if trying to turn her into a bantamweight was a giant waste of time.
You go too far, Luke Thomas.
Hot take. There you go. You guys can work on that one. What I don't. Did we not get up on here and say, what are we waiting for?
Right.
Like she has a limited shelf life. There's no weight class for her. So what? There's a bunch of good bantamweight fighters. You have 6 bantamweight fighters now who all you could even finagle a title shot. You really could.
Right.
Keep them busy. Have them go up there, and none of them are shy about it. How many have been on Twitter being like, I'll go up there and fight her, I don't care. Oh, what's he going to do to the division? What are we, what? These are not reasons not to do it. She'll have how many fights in UFC at this point? She's in her early 30s as well, not a lot. It's just wasting what you have in somebody who could be, I'm not saying the biggest star in the world, but a lot more than what she is now. Yeah. Go up and do it. I cannot believe, let's think about this. I cannot believe it took this long. Look, if you're going to negotiate.
By the way, it's not 100%.
I understand.
Yeah.
But if you're going to negotiate a deal, right? The deal has to happen for mutual benefit. If deals just don't work, and I know this is an obvious point, but just think about this for a second. Like, who won in that whole Cyborg UFC thing? Okay, UFC didn't lose because they're so much bigger than just Cyborg is, but nobody won. Fans didn't win. Cyborg didn't win. UFC didn't. No, everyone was a loser. So this, at least many people come out to be winners. I again failed to see the problem.
Now you cited the connection being that they're fighting in basically her hometown in Brazil. That might be the connection, but what's the other thing that is different now than when this whole thing began? Back then, they had a one-woman show. It was Ronda Rousey, and the only thing that anybody was going to ever accept was to get Cyborg in the cage with Ronda Rousey. That was the only fight that anybody could talk about. But now, it's not a one-woman show anymore. Now we've got her biggest Ronda's biggest arch enemy has the belt, and the person who conquered her is still around. And there's Rousey still around. You've got Nunes still around. You've got Zingano. You've got basically a 135-pound division. Some of those top people would be willing to go up a little bit in weight and face her. So it's kind of like I sort of look at it more. I mean, it's convenient that it's happening in Brazil now, but it's also that no longer is there this kind of bubble wrap around their esteemed champion. Who, not to say that Rousey was going to dodge her, but certainly the UFC was not willing to put that asset out and perhaps get it smashed by Cyborg.
So let me ask you this: do you interject her into? I mean, her resume speaks for itself. She certainly warrants being in that title talk, or at least big time player talk. I'm talking about like the 3-4-headed monster that is Ronda, Misha, Holly, if you want to include like a Kat Zingano in there, Amanda Nunes maybe. Although it is funny, when Amanda Nunes started with I believe Strikeforce way back in the day, she was the one that they were grooming to fight Cyborg, but it never really panned out for her when she was fighting at 145. Anyhow, do you put her in that discussion and have one of those fighters fight up? Because at this point, as you mentioned, it's a little too risky to have her fight at 135. Or do you kind of introduce her? Do you put her against the, say, Jermaine Darondami type? Fun fighter, no one in contention, just have her, blow through someone. What do you do? Because I find that to be the most interesting part of this whole discussion.
I find it most interesting that Conor McGregor has literally blurred the lines of all. I feel like it's Conor McGregor has done. Now we've got RDA calling out guys like Robbie Lawler who wants to do a super fight. It's like the vision suddenly became very strange. Like people are just. We were open to the idea of people kind of jumping ship. That's what it feels like.
Yeah.
And I feel like now they're saying, we didn't really want to accommodate one person for 145. We didn't want to accommodate one person as an exception in the time. But now they're saying, it sort of makes sense to have the business where we can have intriguing fights. They're sort of steering that way, it feels like to me. And to me, we've been talking about this for a long time. I feel like she should be fighting, but she kept flirting with coming down to 135 and all this stuff. There's all this. At this point, I'm like, wouldn't you just like to see that partition down to see her fighting? I feel like that's where we're at. And I'm all for it. And she should be in that. It's complicated, but it's no more complicated than some of these other things, like the Conor McGregor discussion at this point, because you're like, where does he fight? Where does he fight? I feel like it's just one of those things you're like, well, let's put together fights that make the most sense. And, from the UFC's perspective, that makes the most sense business-wise. If they're going into Brazil to do this 40,000-seater, let's put her against somebody that's going to draw, and obviously I think, like you said, they could build Cyborg into a bigger star. You could build huge clashes in however way you want to do it. And there are so many good options. Kat Zingano being a bigger, 135er would be, she hasn't fought in a year and had a bad showing. I'm sure that would be a great fight. Wouldn't that be fun, like, to contemplate that sort of fight?
It's a sick fight.
Yeah. So I'm like, in my mind, it's like, it's just, you didn't want to accommodate her before just as an exception, but at this point I feel like we're sort of blurring the lines anyway on a lot of these things, so why not? And I feel like she obviously belongs right there in that discussion. The more intrigue you can bring to the women's division, 135, 145, kind of bringing them together, it's all good by me.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's got to be it's got to be a real fight. I mean, I think if you put her in against somebody who she's going to go out and do what she always does in Invicta or any of those other previous promotions, what's the point? What's the point? Just so we can have her name there. Why not give her a challenge? Why not put her against somebody in that top 5 somewhere? I mean, they're not going to put her in against Miesha Tate, obviously. They're not going to do that. And they're not going to put her in against Ronda Rousey. But then you still have 3 more. And I don't know that they would. I mean, Holly Holm has expressed an interest in fighting her. I imagine Kat Zingano would, and Nunes. I mean, there's one of those three. And
also, like, what do you do with her? Whatever you want. This is totally. This is wide open field. You can give her a contender. You can not give her a contender. You can put her on pay-per-view. Hell, you can put her on Fight Pass. You can just find her some 145er out there for her to feed on like it's an Invicta show. Put her on the Fight Pass portion of the card. Watch her viewers spike higher than normal, and it's a winner. Like, the only reason you haven't released her is so Scott Coker doesn't get her. Okay, I understand that. So make use of her in a productive way that benefits you. Just having her, just killing her in the media because she can't make 135. What? Again, I ask, who benefited from that? There is literally no beneficiary whatsoever.
Yeah, I sincerely hope that they get it done, but isn't it just nice to think of the possibility of Cyborg fighting people who are on her level? Like, that's been the most uncomfortable part of this past couple of years with Invicta. Like, she's annihilating these women who have no business being in the cage with her. Like, it's almost...
I can't scrub the Jan Finney fight from my mind.
Oh, that was even before.
I know.
And the last one she had, what was the most relevant fight? I mean, the Marloes Kunin fight, the last one she had, that was the most relevant?
That was a long time ago.
Okay. She beat the brakes off Marloes Kunin.
Oh, you're talking about the rematch.
Yeah.
I was thinking of the first one.
No, the one in Invicta.
Yeah.
She beat the brakes. I mean, that was even worse. That was even worse beating.
I was listening to, last week we talked briefly about the mainstream media speaking about MMA. I was listening to Bill Simmons talk to the great Dan Wetzel about UFC 196, and they were talking about Home Tate and how, back in the day, I think it was called Foxy Boxing or something like that. Like, people just kind of looked at female boxing like it was a joke, right? And now, they go to UFC 196 and people are looking forward to Home Tate as much as McGregor Diaz to a degree. Like, they're legitimate. They've earned their spot. They can main event, no problem. No one even distinguishes, really. And the UFC doesn't even call it the women's bantamweight title. They just call it the bantamweight title. But Simmons said something very interesting, and he's somewhat of an MMA guy. He's like, I don't really care if it's for the belt or not. I just, when I watch these UFC events, I just want to see great fights. And that's why they didn't mind that Diaz was fighting McGregor. It was sort of boxing-like, and boxing belts mean nothing. So that just speaks to, like, if they finally put Ronda Cyborg, the world would watch, and they would make a lot of money. No one cares anymore if it's for a belt or not, right?
A little bit. I mean, I think UFC's reluctance to do the kind of things that boxing does, where they just mix and match all the time, is well placed. I like that they want to keep things strict, that they want to be by the book, that they want to maintain divisions. I like that. But at the same time, this is not a world we can live in. What is their corporate strategy on a dry erase board somewhere in Las Vegas? They have to have a little bit of flexibility. They've got a scenario that doesn't. It doesn't work for their traditional model, but it doesn't make any sense for them to just rigidly hold to their traditional model. They're cut off the nose to spite their own face. Like, it doesn't work. And so, having a little bit of ingenuity and having a little bit of just calming some of those standards, I think is the right way to go. But to your point, I like that they're a little bit rigid about it, even if it's lost on the Bill Simmons.
I would go halfway to what you're saying. I think the belts matter. And the fights that are for a belt, I think, have to rise to a certain standard. You can't just put the champion in against the person who's going to sell the most. I don't think that's the way. The only reason Conor McGregor should have gotten a shot at RDA was because he also was a champion at 145. He had not qualified as a lightweight. And I think an RDA's Conor McGregor fight right now would be illegitimate because McGregor has lost to a lowly ranked lightweight. So I think that matters. However, to your other point about Rousey and Cyborg, not every fight has to be for a belt for it to matter, and fights that are not still could be the hugest fights out there. I mean, again, we just mentioned McGregor and Diaz. That was a huge fight. That did not have a championship on the line. It was still a really big fight. So I think you can have it both ways. As long as you you have some regard for that, for when a fight does have a championship on the line. It's okay to also have fights that have nothing other than this is a great fight on the line.
I like keeping it, like you said, I like them to keep it rigid for the most part. But every now and again just to throw one of those in, because the reason Diaz and McGregor became so fun is because it was sort of thrown out there, but it didn't seem like a realistic option, even though they did discuss it and all that. But it didn't seem like a realistic, there was no way to bring it together. Well, 11 days notice, we can throw this thing together. It became a lot of fun. You realize when that partition comes down, you can actually imagine this fight. It becomes a lot of fun. So I feel like there's, in terms of intrigue, and especially from mainstream media and everybody else who wants to watch a fight like that, you got to do those occasionally. I have no problem with them doing it occasionally. Like putting one guy that you know is going to go against this guy, and for some reason that's just a fun matchup. I'm all for it.
Now, Chuck, as I said earlier, reports last night that they're looking to book Anderson Silva versus Uriah Hall on this card, UFC 198, May 14th. Do you like this fight? I mean, Anderson Silva went from being champion to fighting Nick Diaz to Bisping to now Uriah Hall. Not a title contender, a fun fight. Hall was compared to him back in the day on Tough. Does this make sense for Anderson at this point?
It's like the figurative passing of the baton or something like that. I don't know. I don't know if it makes 100% sense, but at the same time, you kind of think about their fighting styles, and that's sort of fun to think about. And I think Uriah Hall, particularly because I believe he's now kind of coming into his own. When they had him on the show, I felt like that was very premature. Obviously, he was working out a lot of his own instincts at that point. I felt like his instinct might have not even been to be in the cage. You know, it's like I think he had to sort of sharpen some of that stuff. It was very. You could talk to him about it, and you could hear his internal conflict with fighting and stuff like that. I feel like he's now in a place where he's ready to do something like this. He got that big Gegard Mousasi win, so I'm like. I can see it from that standpoint. I think more though it's to accommodate maybe Anderson Silva at this point. Like he needs a guy who's maybe little maybe a guy just to get rolling again if that's what he wants to do. And I feel like this is the type of step maybe that he would want to take. The Mousasi fight, I really felt if he'd gotten Mousasi, I felt like that could have been a really bad.
You like that? Oh,
if Mousasi had fought Anderson Silva, I just feel like that might be beginning of the ice flow being kicked off for Anderson Silva, but I'm okay with Hall. And Hall could beat him. I mean, that's one of those types of things. So it has a little bit of intrigue.
I guess I'm not that big on this fight. I think if your goal is to give the Brazilian fans a big show and have Anderson Silva back out there, I think he shines the most when he's fighting an aggressive guy, a guy who comes at him and he could just do his matador act and just really beat that aggressor. And Hall is a guy who's, for the most part, is a little bit hesitant sometimes. When he gets engaged, he can show some stuff. But a lot of times we see him sort of on the outside, a little tentative. And I don't know if he's going to be the guy that's going to come at Anderson Silva and engage that Anderson Silva that we've come to appreciate. We'll find out.
Yeah, I mean, I was like two counter strikers who just pose off a lot all the time. I don't know how I feel about that one. I mean. We'll see. I mean, I don't know how it's going to go, but my initial reaction was like, But it was interesting to me.
A lot of ho-humness to this fight.
It doesn't blow my skirt up in any
Would
particular
you have preferred like a Kennedy or a Mousasi or any other?
No, I'm thinking about this. This is the problem with middleweight. Like all of the top guys, there's no young guys surging through the ranks. This is the interesting part about Anderson Silva. You knew that when he eventually was going to lose, that the person who would beat him, at least you thought the person would beat him, would get this, not direct transference of power and prestige, but there'd be some kind of rub. And Chris Weidman kind of sort of got it because of the nature of the losses, though. They were kind of, it was a half-half.
Yeah.
And then he loses. And who has he fought since? Nick Diaz. Nick Diaz got somewhat of a rub from it. Then he fought Michael Bisping. Bisping got something of a rub from it. And now he's going to fight Uriah Hall. But these guys are all older and later in their careers. I felt like there was never that young guy popping up at middleweight. They could have been like, that guy should fight Anderson Silva.
You don't think Uriah Hall is the guy?
I think we kind of know who Uriah Hall is at this point.
He's not in that tier yet. That's the thing. That's what I see. I mean, I feel like there's that tier of guys you're talking about that have always been facing one, and you got that second tier who haven't made the way up. This is one of those.
Who did Hall lose to in his last fight? Whitaker. Okay, that's what I'm talking about. Like he beats Mousasi. Like, look, Uriah Hall is a quality fighter. Period. Full stop. End of argument. He is a very quality fighter. When he's on his game, he is an elite fighter. That is true. But he is very much inconsistent. There's no denying it. And he's also a little bit longer in the tooth than he was when he was on The Ultimate Fighter. Sure. And so now you're like, this is the guy you're going to get. I mean, look, it's not a terrible fight by any stretch of imagination. I just wish middleweight had someone coming through. Like when John Jones came through, everyone's like, well, he beat all the old guys. All the old guys with names.
Yeah.
All the old guys with names. He ran through all of them. That was really good for him. I feel like Anderson Silva has been sort of handing out his mortal coil to like guys who are less than deserving.
I'll say this, regardless of the opponent, again, I love the fact that they're saying Anderson Silva, Curitiba, we have to put him on this card. It makes sense.
Sure, that sense, it makes total sense, right?
Yes, and also, it's somewhat surreal to see Anderson, like, Shogun Rua is going to fight Corey Anderson on this card. That's surreal to a degree.
That's super surreal.
Although we've sort of seen, I mean, he fought OSP and lost. Like, this has been coming for a while for Shogun. It's surreal to see Anderson in this spot now, where they're almost using him to maybe propel someone else and make a new star at 185. You know what I mean? Like, wow, it's amazing just how things change. Okay, let's move on from that. A developing story this week. The UFC, or I should say MMA in New York. It's very much a UFC story because, let's be honest, the reason why MMA has been blocked out of New York for a very long time has been because of the ongoing saga between Zuffa and the Culinary Union, their parent company Unite here in New York. We don't have to go through that. I think most people know the story by now. But it has, the bill to legalize MMA in the great state of New York has passed through the Senate for 7 straight years. The issue has always been, as Mark Ratner, the VP of Regulatory Affairs for the UFC, has always said, we never got our chance at bat in the Assembly. And in order for a bill to become legal in New York, it has to pass through the Senate and the Assembly. Well, it passed once again through the Senate here in New York, and all signs point to it actually coming up for a vote next week. How about that? Dana White sends out a smiley face tweet. Our friend of the show, Mark LaMonica, and Jim Genia also both reporting that it's looking very good, that it's finally going to be brought up for a vote next week, and they expect, if it is brought up for a vote, that it will pass.
There's a parade outside. I was walking over here today, and there was like people.
Yes.
There was a parade happening.
This is very exciting.
It's very exciting.
For many reasons. But I don't want to get too crazy. Let's just have some fun. Now that we know that the end is possibly near, that they have earmarked a date in November. This could be happening in 8 months. MSG, UFC, craziness. Now that we know it's coming, what's the perfect fight? What's the main event? Now that it's almost here, you know what I mean? And we could start now playing real fantasy matchmaker. What's the perfect fight for this debut show? Is it anything? Can you do John Vellante versus Tom Lawler as the main event and it will sell out?
You just took it.
That's it?
So what else you got on your docket? What else should we talk about?
You do Mickey Gall, Mike Jackson too.
Is that it?
Jeez, man, I don't know. John, you would think John Jones is on the card. All the Sarah's guys are going to be on the card.
I think there's one perfect fight.
Okay, let's hear it.
I don't want to overstep because I asked the question.
You have the perfect fight.
I think, but it affects UFC 200. But I have a reason. I have a backup plan for 200. Let's skip to.
What would be the perfect fight, Ariel? What do you think?
It's got to be Frankie Edgar, Conor McGregor. Frankie Edgar from Toms River, New Jersey. He's from this area, the tri-state area. Plus, it's.
But see, you can't.
What?
I was going to make a disparaging joke about people from New Jersey.
But
don't do it.
He'll sell a lot of tickets. But again, I think anyone sells tickets on that first show. But it also becomes Italy versus Ireland because he is Italian-American, big market here. The Irish community in New York is gigantic, right? We know that. Yeah. Boxing.
Yeah, but Italians don't rally behind Edgar. Like
the Italian-American community here in New York, if even needed, and they're not needed, but it becomes somewhat, because you remember John Duddy?
He's not like Miguel Cotto.
No, but you remember John Duddy, the boxer?
Yes.
He used to fight at MSG and sell the place out.
Yeah.
Irish, right?
Yeah.
So, the Irish alone will sell out this thing. MMA fans alone, you can make it any fight. But I just feel like this New York guy, essentially, tri-state area guy, Frankie Edgar, who's always been, hardworking blue collar, against Conor, the biggest star in the sport, and all the Irish fans, and all the people from Ireland coming over. That's the fight. I mean, there's no other fight.
I'm going to disagree with you on this one.
Get out of here.
For 2 reasons.
I'm leaving.
Number one, I think McGregor against Edgar needs to be at UFC 200. I think it needs to happen sooner than that.
That's the problem with my fantasy here.
That's number one. Number two is Madison Square Garden, the most famous arena in the world, the place where, Chuck just wrote a really nice essay for the Roots of Fight folks about the fight of the century. You did. No, Joe Frazier, Muhammad Ali, they had no ties to New York City. Madison Square Garden does not need local ties. You do not have to get local. This is the Mecca.
You don't have to tell me about the Mecca, my friend.
Get the biggest,
you got to come back with something.
Okay, I'll give it to you. You get the biggest fight, and I'm going to say I've argued many times here that John Jones, even though he's from upstate New York, is not a New Yorker, not a New York fighter the same way. But I'm going to put him on the card.
Main event.
If he beats Daniel Cormier in his next fight, main event, Madison Square Garden, John Jones challenging for the heavyweight championship.
It's a big. How about just Ronda Rousey? She wants to come back around November,
yeah.
right? Why not that?
Main event?
Yeah, are you kidding? Ronda Rousey in New York City, the #1 media market in the world. They love her more than we love her. And,
Sure.
Yeah, of course. Like that seems to be
Ronda
like
for the belt.
Ronda
Misha 3?
regardless. Yeah, sure. I don't know why you wouldn't do
The
that.
interesting, the good dilemma that the UFC has if this actually happens
Also,
is
just think about it. For MMA fights, like you don't get a lot of huge East Coast fights.
Oh, yeah.
In the same
This is
kind of
exciting.
way. This would be a
That's true.
big East Coast fight.
But
And they're going to have to blow it out, obviously.
Of course.
That's
Well,
Yeah,
that's the interesting
no doubt.
thing. Like, do you put Conor, Ronda, John Jones, Chris Weidman if he wins? I mean, you know what I mean? Like, let's be honest. If Chris Weidman wins the belt in June, this guy's actually done a lot of work campaigning and lobbying.
Yeah.
He deserves to be on that card as well.
Of course.
Do you put all those guys on the card?
I don't know. I think it's a little dicey, but
You don't think Conor McGregor wants to be on the MSG card? And we've learned that what he wants, he gets.
He wants that East Coast fight. He talked about
wants
that.
Don't you think Frankie Edgar would be more willing to wait it out? I don't know. I mean, I know I've talked to Frank. I know how angry he is about this stuff, but I'm like, if he knew it was going to be at MSG, I feel like that might change it for him a little bit. He's been lobbying for this for a long time.
I have a tingly sensation in
Also,
my body just talking about it. Because I don't know about all
I
of you.
spoke to Frankie yesterday. He's still recovering from injury.
Yeah.
Right.
And I to the point where I asked him, I was like, could you even make 200? And he said, yes, he could make 200. But to your point, he could quite comfortably make November. And I don't think it'd be as much of a delay as some people think, given the state of his current physical condition.
Wouldn't mind seeing Tamden McCory, the Barn Cat,
Yeah,
New
yeah.
Yorker, getting that
Rochester.
card. Yeah.
I think Conor Frankie, Ronda Misha, or John Jones, Rumble Johnson. Not sure I'm down with the whole heavyweight thing at this juncture. I think it's a little too soon for John Jones, and
soon?
I don't want to disrespect our man DC here. I mean, there's a title
Well,
fight
I
coming
said
up.
if. There's
Yeah,
all.
yeah.
It was all.
That's
an
the
if.
problem. There's a lot
Everything's
of
an
ifs
if.
still. Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing.
It is fun
When
to
we're
think
talking
about how they
fights-
build that card. To me, it's bigger than 200, in my opinion. Is it not?
It really,
yeah.
depending on how it works and the timing and everything else, it really
Timing-wise, it really could end up being, especially with Rona coming back,
Yeah.
if that's really her time. GSP, who I obviously don't think will be there for UFC 200, but I mean, if he's flirting, that might be the timetable for
East
him.
Coast. And I know you guys will scoff at this, but there's one guy on that roster that has actually sold out MSG. There's one guy that can actually claim that he has sold out
Are you going to
MSG.
say CM Punk?
That is a fact. He has sold out MSG. That is a fact. Do you not put him on that card at this point?
I mean, Carlos Mencia has sold out.
No, but he's on the roster.
I was at that show, it was very good.
Adele, freaking
He's on
Coldplay. I went to a Coldplay concert.
And oh, by the way, Mickey Gall is from New Jersey.
Oh my God.
That should be the main
New
event.
Yorker versus Bridge and Tunnel. That's how you do
Be
it
the
right
fight
there.
last main event.
That-
Conan,
Gosh, I'm surprised. Okay, so then it goes back to now what do you do at UFC 200?
Yeah.
I don't know if you guys saw this TMZ video.
But real question for clarification on
Yeah.
200. Is Velasquez versus Brown the only declared fight for 200 that we have?
Well, technically it's not declared because
Okay, well,
they haven't addressed it.
right, but
There are other fights, but I don't feel comfortable talking about them.
This is the beat, baby.
Not-
It's
not
just
at
us.
this
We're a
juncture.
small group.
I'm not ready to
just
release
us.
those nuggets.
We're the only
But
one.
here's the thing: as I slowly trail off the camera, I get so excited about. Okay, so in my fantasy world, it's McGregor versus Edgar at MSG. That's what I think is the fight. I mean, freaking hell,
be a great fight.
give Frankie Edgar a bone for God's sakes. I mean, that's a legacy fight for him. Now, what do you do at 200? We know Conor wants to be on that card. I don't know if you guys saw. Do you see this TMZ video of Conor shopping and trying to,
you could have
dodge.
stopped that. Did you see that TMZ
Okay.
video?
Then he's shopping,
of course.
and if you really listen to what he has to say, and I go back to my comments last week, this Diaz rematch is a real thing, and I feel like no one's jumping on this.
Well, for what?
Why? Why
What,
would we
what
jump
interest
on
could
it?
there
No,
possibly be?
I
It's a
feel like-
vanity. It's vanity.
well, what does that mean?
There's no meaning. It's not like
How would
Diaz
you-
took his championship. If they were fighting at 145 and Diaz took his title, okay, give him his rematch to see if he can regain his title. But why would we do a non-title rematch just to make Conor McGregor feel better about himself?
Right, exactly.
So you don't like it?
For what purpose?
If you're the UFC and say this thing did 1.4, 1.5, do we not try to recreate the magic? Is it too short-sighted to do that?
If you want to deviate outside the norm of their typical division building and things like that, that's fine. But there's a limit to it, right? I mean, you have to rein it in when it no longer makes sense. Conor McGregor is obviously worthy of the majority of the accolades we heap on him, but he got housed in that fight. He got housed by a guy on 10 days' notice. And McGregor can probably tell himself, I could fight differently next time. Knock, knock. So is Diaz. Diaz can fight differently next time, too. It doesn't work. I don't like it at all. Now, 2 years down the road, I made this point on my live chat yesterday, like doing rematches, and this was for a divisional title, but there was a 2 or 3 year gap between the first two times that Liddell and Couture fought each other. And there was very different outcome that second and eventually that third time. I don't mind rematches between important guys if there's enough of a waiting period in between. But if they're going to just force it right away, no thanks.
And you know, when Diaz knocks him out the second time, what's going to be left for Frankie in November when they come to the Garden? I mean, what's going to be left? What will Frankie then be doing in November? As Conor McGregor gets beaten twice by Nate Diaz, is there still some juice in that fight? Plus, there's no way that the UFC can let McGregor fight another time outside of the 145-pound division and have him still be champion of that division. I mean, it just would be promotional.
I don't know what the word is.
What's the word? Promotional. What is it? You used to say it, right? Promotional something or other.
Radicality?
Malfeasance or something. Yeah.
What do you think?
I'm sort of torn on it, but ultimately I agree with these guys. I just don't see why they would need to do it. It's not just because of McGregor, like kind of, well, let's give him his mulligan, against this guy, but it's also because Nate Diaz really, he was an odd mix to begin with anyway. I mean, he was an underdog winning that Michael Johnson fight. It was a close fight, and then he calls him out, and calling him out gets him the shot ultimately in the end. Then they do it back. I mean, it's just, you're sort of taking away all the landscape that was vying for those shots, that are trying to get, the shot at Conor McGregor, that's trying to get RDA, all these guys. It's just, it keeps everything sort of hijacked. And in my mind, I'm like, after you try something like that, you got to reopen it up, because it's months between each, defense or whatever. So it's like, you got to go back now and do 145. That would be my instinct.
What do we do at 200 then? I mean, we're getting close to 200. This is typically when the UFC starts to announce. It's an interesting time, right?
Yeah.
Is it trickier for the UFC now if you compare it to 100? And at this point, like March of 2009, we knew most of the card for 100. Brock, Frank Mir 2, Hendo Bisping, GSP Thiago Alves. Those were the top 3 fights.
Belcher Akiyama, and then John Fitch, Thiago Alves.
No, Thiago Alves fought.
George St. Pierre. John Fitch, somebody.
Yes. Well, also John Jones was on the card.
Prelims. Against Jake O'Brien.
Yep. There it is. Jake O'Brien. 2 mentions on the same show. How about that? So we're March. We're, less than 4 months away at this point. There were a lot less shows back then than there are now. So if you look at 197, Jones DC, you look at 198, what they're doing, even 199 with Cruz and Faber, those are pretty solid cards. What do we have left for 200? You guys don't think that at this point, like, it's starting to get a little dicey?
Yeah, I do.
Or does 200 just sell itself?
I don't know. Maybe we have outsized expectations to begin with. When they announced 200 at the previous July, I was like, oh man, this is going to be big. Because if you remember during the first UFC 100, the promoters had said, we had planned to do a good show, but then we heard everyone asking, hey, what are you going to do for 100? What are you going to do for 100? They kind of got a clue that they should really ratchet it up. But obviously, to your point, that in July of 2009, they had much fewer shows. I think people keep telling me they're going to do 3 title fights. I don't see that at all.
Oof,
but I think they can manage.
Kiss of death.
I know. I think they can manage 2, Conor and something else. I don't know what it's going to be, but to your point, it seems like Velasquez versus Brown is going to be in that card. Okay,
that's a nice pay-per-view fight, but it's not a co-main.
But to your point, like we don't have a title fight yet. We don't have another title. We don't have any title fights for it yet. And Ultimate Fighter's not going to dovetail into it. Not that we can tell. So,
no, Joanna and Claudia are fighting night before.
Right, but not on the card itself.
Yeah.
So now they've removed also that element from it as well. It's gonna be interesting.
Are we 100% sure that Ronda Rousey could not fight at UFC 200?
Yeah. Well, she's biting apples now. This is big news. I don't know if you guys saw that.
That seems awfully early in the redevelopment of one's damaged biology.
Well,
like
that's true.
If you can bite apples, like, okay, great. That's stage 1 of 75,000.
Oh, sure. I was poking fun at this being a big...
I thought you were like, you can bite apples.
No.
Yes.
I was actually making a joke. You had to look at my face.
Sorry.
When I made the joke. No, but I think it's a real thing. I mean, look, heavyweight division, that title is being defended in May. So that's kind of out of the picture, right? Light heavyweight division, okay, John Jones, Cormier.
The turnaround is possible.
For the light heavyweights?
Yeah, it's possible.
Possible, but it's a little risky, right?
Jones did 4 fights in 2011. He has been known to be active when necessary.
Although remember when Jones and Cormier finished that fight last year, they were kind of beat up, both of them.
Yeah.
I mean, they went through 25 minutes of pretty grueling stuff. Okay, so then let's go to 185. That's being defended in June. Not happening, right? 170 is out there, Robbie Lawler.
Sure, that's around.
Tyron Woodley, is that big enough?
No.
GSP.
Right, that's big enough.
Okay, so that's maybe. 155, Dos Anjos.
They could do something with that.
With who? Khabib Ferguson?
Only
winner?
Only
Eddie Alvarez?
Eddie Alvarez is possible.
Is that big enough for 200?
They could do maybe Pettis if Pettis has a nice turnaround. although he gets injured a lot, so I don't know if they could do that.
And then you got 145, which is the Conor situation.
Right.
135
taken up.
is in June, and then flyweights are fighting.
Demetrius Cruz too.
And then was it women's strawweight is taken up the night before.
The night before.
So then you have women's bantamweight, so that's up for grabs.
So it's really
too.
like 3 titles, and I don't know. And who does Misha fight? Do you roll the dice with Misha Hawley?
We've talked about that last week. I think
Yeah.
that's the way to go. But it's not exactly clear.
There are
but
no layups.
There's no layups. That's right.
I think it's fascinating. I'm really curious to see what they're going to do.
They serve so many masters. It is even for UFC 200. It's hard for them to stack the deck. That's how incredible that is.
Now, I feel like they have a rabbit that they're going to pull out of their hat here. I feel like they've got something. They've been planning for this for too long. As much as they're kind of going month to month.
They're going to sign Trump.
Have you seen that footage of Shane McMahon with Crewfield Nurse?
I have so not seen footage of Shane McMahon with
It
Crewfield
is
Nurse.
impressive the way he's. Anyway, yes, they're going month to month, and 198 is sort of developing in front of our eyes. But I feel like they had to, when they announced this last year, as you said, they had to have some sort of guess or
I hope so.
Right? I mean, they couldn't have known that Ronda Rousey was going to get knocked out, so they probably,
Or
dreamed.
McGregor.
Maybe Ronda
he's still
Cyborg.
viable.
I don't know. I feel like I'm way too concerned about this, and you guys couldn't care less.
No,
to
I-
be honest,
I mean,
I'm
there's a lot
actually
of- I
losing
care, I just
sleep
don't know.
over this,
I mean,
guys.
think
I can't sleep.
You don't want to devalue your other fight cards leading up to it. So I think it's smart of them to have stacked some of the fight cards leading up to it. I
They've
think that-
really stacked.
And I think that's a good thing. I think the other impulse will be, well, we'll just make 198, 199 so, and we're going to put all our eggs in. But I think they've learned that when they try doing that, best laid plans don't always work.
I was about to say, we're always like, oh, this fight's in May, this fight's in June, until one of those jokers gets injured,
Yeah.
and then they wind up pushing it back to UFC 200. Never disregard that possibility, too. They have a lot of big fights right up close to it. If any of those things gets toyed with, they can just ship it on over.
Yeah, I don't know. I kind of felt by now we would have had some sort of guess or vision or blueprint, something as to what's happening. But maybe that makes it more fun and we could talk about it.
Well, you won't
and
tell us
comment.
about it. That's why.
That's
the
true.
problem.
Okay, one last thing before I go, guys. Big weekend for the UFC. They're back. They're in Brisbane. Fantastic main event. Mark Hunt versus Frank Mir. Also, a very interesting co-main event between Hector Lombard and Neil Magny. But I'm wondering if you're more interested in that card or the Your Show super card on Sunday featuring Michael Bisping versus Chael Sonnen grappling match, Rey Mysterio versus Kurt Angle, the Roy Jones versus some fan boxing match.
Roy Jones is fighting fans.
Is this all happening, really? Is this?
You didn't know about this?
I wasn't Tank
Come on.
Abbott supposed to be in this thing?
Take Abbott, Dan Severn got canceled.
This is big.
It's not happening.
What do you think about that?
Wait, isn't Kurt Angle on this one?
I just said against Rey Mysterio.
Oh, right.
You always pretend like you don't know about the wrestling stuff, but then you drop a nugget.
Well, I've
showing
seen his face, and I saw him actually at Bellator
You never
149.
saw his face.
I saw. Let me say this. I saw, and I mean it's true. I'm not even like joning or anything. I saw Kurt Angle at Bellator 149, and the idea that he is athletically competing in anything beyond golf, and I'm not trying to be disparaging, is I can't believe it. I don't know how he walks.
Yeah.
He looks physically broken.
Well, he can't move his neck. He has to move his whole body when he wants to talk
Yeah,
to
but
you.
he
It's
can't
true.
sit up straight either. Like he has to walk like lean forward all the time. It was quite a sight. So to answer your question about my enthusiasm for that, it's high. It's really high.
Our own Sean Al-Shadi will be there covering
Can you
it.
believe that? What Sean?
That's a $1 million story if I've ever seen one.
I know.
Yeah,
Sean,
how do I not get these?
Yeah.
Sean might be one of the most important members on the staff, but for going to that, he is the dumbest person that I know.
This was the guy who was just in Houston for the Kimbo.
Yeah.
Hey, that's real journalism.
By the way, they popped for banned substances. Kimbo and Ken.
Can you believe
Does that change your stance on that event?
No, well, first of all, stance. What stance? I mean,
I don't know what he popped for.
yeah, I mean, here's the thing: we don't know what Kimbo popped for, so we'll see. But there's a certain part of me that wonders. I don't think Ken popped for, marijuana. I'm guessing that's not on the. But God, between those two, I mean, look. If that was not a wake-up call, it's like a guy almost died.
Right.
You've got headliners in their 40s.
Yeah.
50s and 50s.
You've got geriatrics swinging at each other, and they can't get through without passing a drug test. You need to rethink some
Other
things.
than that, though, pretty good card.
Yeah, it was great. It was great.
Great ratings. They'll tell you all about them.
Killer ratings.
To me, the most fascinating part of that story is the lack of interest in it. Like, it came out, our own Mark Ramundi breaks the news, and then, no one even cared.
About the drug test?
Yeah. Like, usually when someone pops, there's hysteria. That thing fizzled by the time Invicta started Friday
because
night.
it's all about, most fight cards are about the lead up, so before it, the fight itself, and then what it means going forward. This was something that was all about the lead up and then the fight. As soon as the thing ended, there was no interest anywhere because there's no lead up. There's no aftermath. There's no next.
You know what I love about it is that they got caught in Texas. This is like getting caught for a bank robbery in a town with no cops. Like how does that happen? Oh,
Only
these donks can figure that out.
You know how it wasn't a big deal? We didn't even get a Mendenhall reaction piece out of it. Like he couldn't even be bothered to write. And you always write about these things. I feel cheated.
Got a piece coming out tomorrow that you'll like.
About sort of related to that.
Sort of related. Yeah.
All right. Fair enough. Okay. On that note, we say goodbye. Again, please party responsibly as you celebrate St. Patrick's Day.
Why are you looking at me like that?
it was a very...
I'm sober now.
It was a very interesting ride here to do the show. You would not believe what's going on out there. We are going to run for the hills.
It is the planet of the apes out
yes.
there. Yes.
I hope you all appreciate that we're actually here and dodged many human bullets to get to this point. So anyway, if you are celebrating and having a good time, please celebrate responsibly. Thank you so much for watching the show this week. Thank you for checking it out. And guess what? We're back next week for another episode. How about that? For now, we say goodbye, though. That is Luke. That is Jeff. That is Chuck. I am Ariel. Again, thank you for watching. Enjoy your weekend.